During their wedding ceremony, the groom loses his temper and slaps the bride across the face, leaving all the guests in shock. Then the bride's father does this. Donald was a 44-year-old man whose integrity was as solid as the walls of the old family home, built by generations that he now struggled to honor. His life had been shaped by difficult decisions, each of them weighing on his shoulders like stones he accumulated without ever unloading. As the head of a family that once enjoyed wealth and prestige, he found himself faced with the challenge of maintaining a legacy that seemed to slip through his fingers like fine sand. Bad business deals and growing debts had tarnished the reputation he inherited, and the fear of imminent bankruptcy became his constant companion. Even so, Donald refused to give up. It was in this whirlwind of uncertainties that he made the decision he believed to be his only chance to save everyone around him. An arranged marriage for his only daughter, Ashley, 20 years old. Making such a decision was tormenting, stretching across nights of discussion with his wife, who initially rejected the idea vehemently. However, under the crushing pressure of the circumstances, both eventually accepted, although the sorrow was palpable in their shared silences. The chosen groom, Edward, was the son of a wealthy and influential family, whose fortune seemed to guarantee stability and security. Donald had met Edward's father many years ago, a serious and respected man, but knew little about the young man himself, relying solely on the good reputation of the lineage. Ashley, with her delicacy and relentless desire to please her father, accepted without questioning, hiding her own hopes and fears behind a gentle smile. Donald, in the kindness that guided his actions, never imagined that the choice he made with a heart full of hope could in fact bring so much suffering to the person he loved most. The days following the decision of the marriage were marked by a strange mixture of relief and apprehension in Donald's house. For him, every small step forward in the preparations was confirmation that he had made the right choice. He watched Ashley with tender eyes, convinced that she was satisfied, even though her smile was a little more shy than usual. Edward visited the house often, and his polite manners reinforced Donald's belief that he would be a good husband. "Edward seems like such a promising young man, don't you think?" Donald said to his wife while they were having coffee on the porch. "Yes, he is. Polite," the woman replied with little enthusiasm. There were still doubts in her heart, but she chose not to voice them. "And Ashley seems to be handling everything well. She's strong like her father," Donald said with a proud smile. Meanwhile, Ashley silently began to deal with a new reality. Edward, who initially seemed only a little reserved, displayed an unsettling coldness. In the first weeks of the engagement, he was courteous but kept an emotional distance. "You don't need to pretend so much enthusiasm," Edward said to her once when she showed him the wedding invitation design. "I just wanted to know your opinion," Ashley replied, trying to hide her discomfort. "Opinion?" He laughed humorlessly. "Do you think I care about flowers or fountains? Do whatever you want as long as it's done?" That conversation stayed in her mind, but she didn't share it with anyone. Edward never raised his voice, but his words had a coldness that made Ashley feel invisible. Still, she pressed on, determined not to disappoint her father. The preparations for the wedding were progressing rapidly. Donald was radiant to see the house full of activity, with friends and family contributing to the details. During one of the meetings between the families, he observed with satisfaction as Edward conversed with the guests. "It's nice to see him fitting in," Donald said, approaching his future son-in-law. Edward turned, raising his glass of wine. "Of course, Mr. Donald. We're all here for a common purpose, aren't we?" "Certainly," Donald replied with a smile. "I hope you're settling in well." "Without a doubt," Edward said, but there was something in his tone that Donald didn't notice. Ashley, on the other hand, noticed every nuance. Edward changed when they were alone. He began making small criticisms about what she wore, how she spoke, even how she smiled. "You don't need to exaggerate so much," he told her one day as she laughed at something a friend had said. "Sorry," she murmured, lowering her eyes. Over time, the comments became more frequent, and Edward's patience grew shorter. "Can't you do anything right?" he yelled after she dropped a glass in the living room. The sound of the glass breaking still echoed as he stormed out, slamming the door. Ashley's apologies to her father and mother were always quick. "He's just stressed from work," she'd say while picking up the shards. Donald believed her, as he saw Edward as a busy man, someone who carried heavy responsibilities. But things only worsened. Edward began drinking more than usual, coming home late and angry. During one of their arguments, he grabbed Ashley by the arm hard enough to leave a bruise. "You're going to drive me crazy," he said, before letting her go. Ashley looked at the bruise on her arm in the mirror that night, but decided to cover it with long sleeves the next day. Donald remained oblivious. "My daughter is happy," he said to his friends. "She found someone who can take care of her." Ashley heard these words, and her heart tightened. She didn't want to destroy her father's happiness, even if it came at the cost of her own well-being. Edward, for his part, was becoming increasingly uncontrollable. One night, after drinking too much, he started yelling at Ashley in front of the maid. "You're useless," he said, while she tried to calm him down. When Donald asked about the incident the next day, Ashley smiled and downplayed it. "It was just a silly argument. Don't worry, Dad." Little by little, she learned to hide everything. She dressed carefully to cover the signs of her pain. She silently listened to Edward's criticisms, while the smile she offered her father became more and more forced. One night during dinner, Donald commented, "It's so nice to see you and Edward getting along. You'll be an unbeatable team." Ashley simply smiled, feeling the lump in her throat tighten. Weeks passed, and the wedding day approached. Donald was more excited than ever, participating in every detail. Meanwhile, Ashley lived a silent nightmare, too scared to confess to anyone. The wedding day arrived, the sun shining in the sky, lighting the church decorated with elegant floral arrangements. Donald walked through the aisles with a broad smile, greeting the guests as they arrived. He was radiant, eager to show everyone the details he had carefully planned. "The lilies match perfectly with the surroundings, don't you think?" he said to one of Edward's uncles, who nodded enthusiastically. "It's really impressive, Donald. You exceeded all expectations," the man responded, shaking his hand. Donald continued to circulate among the guests, introducing family and friends as if conducting a show. "Ah, here's Mr. Ortega, Edward's father. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I hope everything is to your liking." "No doubt, Donald. You've achieved a perfect balance between tradition and sophistication," Ortega replied, showing his appreciation. Meanwhile, upstairs in the church, Ashley was in the bridal room, being prepared for the big moment. She wore a white dress with a delicate veil, while the makeup artist finished the final touches on her face. But behind the flawless appearance, the sadness in her heart was overwhelming. Every detail of the day reminded her of the reality she was facing, a marriage she didn't want, to a man who made her feel invisible and hurt. Her mother entered the room, watching her for a moment in silence. Despite the perfect makeup, she noticed something different in her daughter's gaze. "Are you okay, my dear?" her mother asked, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Ashley looked at her through the mirror and, with effort, forced a fake smile. "I'm fine, Mom. Just nervous like any bride would be." Her mother sighed but didn't press. "You look beautiful as always. Your father will be proud when he sees you." These words were like a dagger to Ashley's heart. Even with all the pain, the only thing that brought her any comfort was Donald's happiness. She took a deep breath, trying to gather strength. The music began to play, announcing the start of the ceremony. The church doors slowly opened, revealing Edward at the altar, dressed in an impeccable suit with a confident smile that only Ashley knew was a mask. Ashley began walking down the aisle, holding the bouquet tightly. The guests looked on in admiration, praising the bride's beauty. Donald, sitting in the front, watched the scene with a mixture of pride and emotion, but when his eyes locked on his daughter, something deeply disturbed him. For the first time since he had made the decision about the marriage, he noticed a shadow of sadness in her gaze. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he knew his daughter well. "She's hiding something," Donald thought, feeling a pang of concern. Ashley reached the altar and stood next to Edward. The priest began the ceremony with solemn words that echoed throughout the church. "We are here gathered to celebrate the sacred union of Ashley and Edward." While the priest spoke, Donald couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He kept his eyes fixed on Ashley, searching for more signs of her unease. Finally, the crucial moment arrived. The priest looked at Edward and asked, "Edward, do you take Ashley as your lawful wife, in health and in sickness, in wealth and in poverty? Until death do you part?" "Yes," Edward replied promptly, with a tone that seemed forced, but was enough to convince most. The priest turned to Ashley. "And you, Ashley, do you take Edward as your lawful husband, in health and in sickness, in wealth and in poverty, until death do you part?" An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Ashley hesitated, unable to answer immediately. For a few seconds, which seemed eternal, she looked at the ground, breathing heavily. Donald, sitting in the front row, felt his heart race. That moment of hesitation confirmed his suspicions. Something was terribly wrong. "Answer now!" Edward shouted, breaking the silence with an outburst of rage. Before anyone could react, he raised his hand and slapped Ashley across the face, making her stagger back. Shock rippled through the church like a wave. A murmur of horror spread among the guests as Donald froze, unable to believe what he had just seen. Ashley's face was marked, but the real pain was in her eyes, which now sparkled with unshed tears. Donald felt a fury that took over every fiber of his being. His entire body trembled, muscles tensed as if about to explode. He fixed his gaze on Edward, who still wore an expression of arrogance, even after the abominable act. Ashley's face, marked by the slap, was all Donald could see. Unable to contain himself, he stepped forward, the rage in his eyes burning like fire. "How dare you!" Donald roared, his voice echoing throughout the church. He stood abruptly and strode down the aisle with firm, indignant steps. Edward saw Donald approach and for a moment tried to disguise his nervousness. He raised his hands defensively. "Wait, Mr. Donald, this wasn't—" he began, but the words died in his mouth. Donald's first punch came with crushing force, hitting Edward in the face and making him stumble back, tripping on the altar step. "You're a wretch, a coward who dares to lay a hand on my daughter," Donald shouted, grabbing Edward by the tie and pulling him down from the altar with surprising strength. Edward, despite being stunned by the first blow, regained his balance and tried to fight back. He was younger and quicker, managing to dodge Donald's next punch, returning with a quick jab to the older man's face. Donald staggered slightly but remained steady, the anger giving him strength he didn't know he had. "You think you can intimidate me?" Edward taunted, delivering another punch that hit Donald's chest. "I'm faster than you, old man!" Donald responded with a precise kick to Edward's leg, momentarily throwing him off balance and advancing again, landing a punch that sent Edward spinning backward. At this point, guests began rushing to intervene. "Stop this! This is a church!" one woman shouted as others tried to pull Donald and Edward apart. But neither man was willing to stop. Edward seized a moment of distraction to shove Donald hard, sending him crashing against a nearby column. "You're pathetic," he yelled. "Did you think I was going to fix your daughter and save this bankrupt family?" These words fueled Donald's rage even more. He lunged at Edward again, grabbing him by the shirt and slamming him to the ground. Edward, however, managed to grab Donald's arm and pull him down, the two rolling on the floor, exchanging punches and furious grunts. "You're a worthless bastard," Donald roared, hitting Edward in the stomach. Edward responded with a punch to Donald's jaw, sending him stumbling to the side. "And you're just an old failure trying to feel important." Guests continued trying to separate them. Two men managed to grab Donald's arms for a moment, but he broke free with a violent movement and landed another punch on Edward, sending him tumbling backward, his face already swollen and his lips bruised. Edward, gasping for air, tried to rise, but Donald was on him, relentless. "Never dare look at my daughter again," he shouted, gripping Edward by the collar of his suit. Edward, with one final effort, kicked Donald in the side, but it only seemed to make him more determined. Donald grabbed Edward's arm and threw him to the ground again, while guests continued their efforts to separate them. "Enough! Please stop!" screamed a woman from the audience, but the two men continued exchanging furious blows. Finally, a larger group of guests managed to restrain both. Two men pulled Donald back with force, while others held Edward, who, already dazed, tried to mutter something. Even separated, the two continued hurling insults at each other. "You were never man enough for her," Donald shouted as he was held back. Edward weakly responded, "Your daughter was never good enough for me." Those words were the breaking point. Donald broke free for a moment, landing one final punch that sent Edward tumbling to the floor, nearly unconscious. It was then that the guests finally managed to pull him away, holding him firm, while others helped Edward to his feet, now unable to continue the fight. The altar was chaos, and murmurs of astonishment filled the air. Donald, panting, cast one last look at Edward. "You're trash. Never dare speak her name again." Edward sat on the floor, his face marked by blows, while Donald was finally pulled away by the firm hands of friends and family. Donald, still gasping, shot one final look of contempt at Edward. "You'll never be man enough for someone like my daughter. Never." The church was plunged into tense silence, broken only by murmurs from the guests, still trying to understand what had happened. Edward lay on the ground, groggy, while Donald, out of breath and with his face marked by rage, was finally restrained by those around him. It was then that he felt a delicate hand touch his arm. "Dad," Ashley said, her voice trembling, eyes filled with tears. Donald turned to see his daughter, still in her wedding dress, her face red from the slap she had received, and eyes watery. It was a sight that devastated him. All the strength that had dominated him moments earlier disappeared, and he dropped to his knees before her, holding her hands. "My girl," he said, his voice choked. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "No, Dad," Ashley said, crying as she tried to help him stand. "It was my fault. I should have told you, should have said everything. I just didn't want you to be sad. I didn't want you to feel guilty for me." Donald looked at her, his eyes now filled with tears. "Guilty? Ashley, you don't understand. I've been guilty from the start. I dragged you into this. I was the one who chose that man for you. All this, all the suffering, it's my fault." "Dad, don't say that," she replied, hugging him as tears flowed down both their faces. "You did what you thought was right. You just wanted the best for us." "And that's exactly what blinded me," Donald said, holding her tight. "I was so focused on saving the family, on saving the legacy, that I didn't see what really mattered. I didn't see you, my daughter, the person I love most in the world." Ashley sobbed in his arms, while Donald ran his hand through her hair, trying to calm her. "You should never have gone through this. Never. I promise I will never again put anything above your happiness. Never again will I ignore what you feel. Forgive me, my girl. Please forgive me." "I love you, Dad," Ashley said, her voice choked, holding on to him as if afraid to let go. "I love you too," Donald replied, kissing her forehead tenderly. The moment was interrupted by the sound of sirens arriving outside the church. The ambulance and police cars parked, and paramedics quickly entered the building. Edward, still on the ground, was placed on a stretcher, His injuries were visible. His swollen face and cut lips were proof of what had happened. Two police officers approached Donald. One of them spoke firmly, but without hostility. "Sir, we need you to come with us to clarify the events." Ashley grabbed her father's arm, her eyes wide with worry. "No, he just did this to protect me." Donald held her by the shoulders, looking her in the eyes. "It's okay, my daughter. I'll go with them. Don't worry." The police officers led him out of the church as the murmurs of the guests grew louder. Donald walked with firm steps, but his eyes were fixed on Ashley, who stood still at the entrance of the church, watching him being taken away. Edward was taken by the ambulance, too weak to even face the looks that followed him. His image of arrogance was completely destroyed. The following weeks were difficult for everyone. Donald was released the same day after giving his statement and with testimony from several guests in his favor. However, the consequences of the fight spread quickly. The relationship between the families was irreparably broken. Edward's father, ashamed, cut all ties with Donald and completely withdrew from any further interaction with the family. Edward, for his part, faced legal action for violence, initiated by Ashley with Donald's unconditional support. During the trial, other instances of abuse were revealed, and Edward lost the respect and status he had accumulated over the years. He was sentenced to community service, and his reputation was forever tarnished. Ashley, though emotionally scarred, began to rebuild her life. With her father by her side, she found the strength to overcome the trauma and rediscover her happiness. Donald, on the other hand, was never the same. The experience transformed him into a more attentive and dedicated man to his daughter's needs. He began to prioritize what truly mattered, the love and happiness of the family. "Ashley," he said one evening while they were having coffee on the porch, "you know I'll never make the same mistake again. I want you to know you have complete freedom to make your choices, whatever they may be." She smiled, holding her father's hand. "I know, Dad. You've always been the best for me, even when you made mistakes." The hug that followed was proof that, despite everything, the love between father and daughter was unbreakable. They had lost much, but also gained something invaluable: the certainty that mutual support was more important than any legacy or convention. And so, the story ended. A lesson in love, resilience, and redemption. What began as a day of celebration turned into a painful memory, but also a turning point that brought father and daughter even closer together, showing that true wealth lies in the bonds we nurture with those we love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.